Religion has profoundly influenced the sweeping American narrative, perhaps more than any other force in our history, from the time of the indigenous peoples to the present day. The National Museum of American Religion tells the surprising and compelling story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, including the establishment of the revolutionary and indispensable idea of religious freedom as a governing principle in the U.S., inviting all to explore the role of religion in shaping the social, political, economic, and cultural lives of Americans, and thus America itself. Join us for Season 3 of our podcast series, Religion in the American Experience, as we follow scholars and others deep into America's religious history and learn how it can inform and animate us as citizens grappling with complex questions of governance and American purpose in the 21st century. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Listeners, welcome to another episode of Religion in the American Experience, a podcast series of the Digital First National Museum of American Religion. Follow us on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts, and be the first to learn of new episodes. Please tell your friends about this podcast, Religion in the American Experience, and if you enjoy today's episode, write a review. That does us a great deal of good. Lodged firmly in the American psyche and a bedrock part of American history is the Great Depression. Beginning with the stock market crash in October of 1929, the market lost 50% of its value in a few weeks. And lasting a decade, it was the worst calamity to hit the United States since the Civil War. Unemployment soared, farms went under, long bread lines formed, people up and left their homes for a better place, and poverty skyrocketed. The emotional toll was likewise severe. For us, at the museum, the question is, in what ways did religion, one of the greatest and most ubiquitous forces in our history, react to the Great Depression? Understanding this will help us better comprehend and perpetuate the American project, including the religion clauses in the U.S. Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. As part of our multi-episode series about religion and the Great Depression, Dr. Randall Stevens is joining us to talk about the Protestant response to the Dust Bowl. Dr. Randall J. Stevens is professor of American and British Studies at the University of Oslo. He previously taught at Northumbria University and Eastern Nazarene College. He is a historian of religion, conservatism, the South, environmentalism, and popular culture, and is the author of several books, including The Fire Spreads, Holiness and Pentecostalism in the American South, and The Devil's Music, How Christians Inspired, Condemned, and Embraced Rock and Roll, and was editor of Recent Themes in American Religious History. Specific to our discussion today, he is the author of an article that came out in the October 2023 issue of Church History, Studies in Christianity and Culture, entitled The Dust Bowl, the Depression and American Protestant Responses to Environmental Devastation. In 2011 and 12, he was a Fulbright roving scholar in Norway. Dr. Stevens received his BA in History at Mid-America Nazarene College and his PhD in American History from the University of Florida. Randall, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
First, Randall, can you tell our listeners how you became interested in this topic, so religion and the Great Depression? Tell us that story.
Yeah, there were a few kind of factors here. For some years, I had taught the Dust Bowl as part of modern American history courses, and I was very interested in just the general history of it and the work that was done by people like Donald Worcester and Timothy Egan. But it did seem like religion, for an area that's, part of H.L. Mencken's Bible Belt, the Great Plains, that religion is often absent there or not as prevalent as I thought it probably should be as a topic. And I had developed a new interest in extreme weather and how that affected Americans and, in the world that we live in now with the extreme weather from climate change and the disruption to our lives and the kind of devastation we see. I think it has a contemporary kind of relevance. And then, even in the last few months in 2023, there's been polling done about evangelicals, white evangelicals, and their views about climate change. And there's a kind of stubborn climate change denialism that you see among white evangelicals. This is the Public Religion Research Institute that did this, that showed that just 3 in 10 white evangelicals thought that climate change was caused by human. So I think there's some kind of contemporary relevance here as well.
I think you're right. I think it's very timely. Would you help our listeners understand the religious landscape at a high level of America at this time generally, and then specific to the American Midwest? Which religions were there and prominent, and in what numbers, and in an effort to help our listeners better understand our discussion today?
Sure. Yeah. Well, when the Depression first starts to set in with the stock market crash late in 29 and then in 1930, the president at the time, Herbert Hoover, who himself was a Quaker, had an idea that the churches would help alleviate the worst of this, so that there'd be a spirit of kind of volunteerism in America. And it just proved that the crisis was too immense and too complex for churches to really deal with this. There's a lot of fear in the 30s that church attendance was declining and that people were becoming less religious, but it doesn't look like it in the work that Allison Green, a historian at Emory, has done about this. There's a kind of steady, at least attendance, that remains fairly flat from the 20s to the 30s. But there are new religious movements like holiness and Pentecostalism that are growing among white and Black Americans at the time, and really kind of maybe in some cases reaping sort of the benefits of hard times, of hardship. And if we look more specifically at the Great Plains and the Midwest, it's fun because you can see kind of patterns of settlement from the East Coast, from Northerners, and even people from New England who settle in Kansas, and people typically from the South who go to Oklahoma Territory or to what becomes Oklahoma State. So in Kansas, you have more Methodists than you have in Oklahoma. And in Oklahoma, you have more Southern Baptists than you have in Kansas. And in Kansas, which is one of the states that's hit worst by the Dust Bowl, you have more Catholics than you do in Oklahoma as well. So it kind of follows these patterns of settlement, across the latitude of the United States as people move west. And then it's not like you find on the East Coast, but there are a smattering of Jewish communities, and there are African-American denominations in both Oklahoma and in Kansas. And of course, going back to the 19th century, there are these free Black communities like Nicodemus that exist in Western Kansas and are still around at the time of the Depression. Some of those other free Black communities in Oklahoma and Kansas have disappeared by this point.
Okay. That's super helpful. And as we'll see, the religious response is varied depending on the denomination. Mm-hmm. And we'll get into that. Randall, you write that, quote, Great Plains farmers in the Depression years sought answers and solace from their denominations and local churches, their Bibles, communities, federal agencies, and local farm organizations. What did they hear?
They heard all sorts of things. They sometimes you even see this in newspapers at the time, in like the Oklahoma Panhandle, editors saying, this is going to clear up, and the Dust Bowl, the destruction of topsoil and these storms of dust that are appearing. We've had hardships here before, and this will soon disappear. So that's something that Timothy Egan and Donald Worcester have written about. There's a kind of stubborn refusal in Dust Bowl counties and states to really come to grips with what's happening. Even in the worst times of it, like 1935, when some of the worst of these dust storms take place. And there are some Great Plains people who look to the New Deal and look to Roosevelt and some of the agricultural policies that Roosevelt has as a real boon to the region and very helpful. But there are quite a few others that I looked at in my own research who reject that and are dismissive of federal efforts and really view that as kind of foolhardy and in some ways almost sacrilegious, like to think that you could somehow mitigate these crises of the era, these natural disasters. Some evangelicals and fundamentalists in the region think that that's just an impossibility and foolishness.
I want to go back though a step and ask you, before the Dust Bowl, before the Depression hit, America was experiencing quite a bit of prosperity. How did Midwestern clergy see this abundance during the 1920s, and what did they say to their people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, some of this has to do with the boom in farming that was a result of World War I, so that the wheat market was really strong and there were really good crop yields in the early 1920s and the late 19-teens. So you do see, in newspapers and denominational magazines, you see pastors talking about the abundance of this era and what that means and sort of the blessings of God. And so there are official kind of proclamations of thanksgiving. And for people who are so steeped in Scripture, some of this looks like it's right out of the pages of the Bible. So in Psalms and in Proverbs, you have verses about the abundance that comes to the people of God who are faithful. And so you can see sometimes that they're drawing on that in sermons, but even on a higher level, you have governors in these states that are issuing Christian proclamations of thanksgiving about the agricultural abundance that they're experiencing. It starts to change by the mid-20s with drought and with a decline, but you certainly see a lot of it. And it's a part of this kind of providentialist thinking that's very common in Protestantism and Catholicism in this era.
Okay. And then the Depression hits, and as you say, there's varied responses to that. Some clergy embraced the New Deal, some didn't. Can you tell us a little bit more? So I have in my notes Fosdick, a speech he gave, or a sermon called "Does Prayer Change Weather?" which is somewhat famous. And then also maybe on the other end of the spectrum, and I think you mentioned this a little bit, that some clergy saw the Depression, the Dust Bowl, as some sort of God-inspired or a holy retribution for national sins.
Yeah.
Ill treatment of the earth, even some denominations, I think, if I remember, say things like this.
Yeah, that was something that the historian Peter Thusen gave me, the Fosdick piece that appeared in Christian Century. I think you had him on maybe in an earlier episode where he was talking about weather, tornadoes.
It was our first podcast episode, yeah.
Yeah. And he's done really interesting work about this. And it's just the perfect source because Christian Century is a liberal to left Protestant publication. It's like the main mouthpiece for liberal the established Protestantism of the era. And they have this kind of roundtable on, can prayer change the weather, in the early 30s, I think it is. And, most of them who take part in that, who are starting to think in more secular terms about cause and effect, just say, no, this is crazy to even think this. And, sometimes the criticism would have been, this is near pagan in its notion of cause and effect, to think that prayer can change things in the natural world like this, which would have been just very offensive to so many conservative Christians and Protestants and Catholics on the Great Plains. So, there's this kind of divide that I wanted to talk about in my article that we're already seeing, between Americans who we can call them conservative, but the term doesn't really work entirely. But, thinking about fundamentalists, Pentecostals, holiness people who have a more providentialist understanding of cause and effect. And this kind of a smaller group of liberals within mainline Protestantism who have quite a lot of power and are leaders of denominations and are activists who are taking a very different view. And there's a lot of animosity. These groups, don't think very highly of each other, and it could be very dismissive about the kind of power that the other group has.
Right. that those are very different ways to look at the world, and specifically to the depression, on the depression, look at the depression, and it's good to understand, I think, that this conflict between these two sort of sides, religious people. Let's get down a little bit into the weeds. So, also from your book, you write, quote, America's rural churches had experienced the strains of the Depression years more acutely than other social institutions, close quote. Can you help our listeners understand what these strains were exactly and their effects? You mentioned it briefly about churches, that this is too big for churches to handle, but on the ground, they were obviously doing things. What were these strains, and how big were they, and what were the effects?
Yeah, it's really intense for these, especially smaller churches and smaller denominations that are, the worst impact of the Dust Bowl is the Oklahoma Panhandle, the Texas Panhandle, and then the southwestern corner of Kansas. So you literally have churches that are just closing their doors, that have been the centers of communities for years, but people are pulling up stakes from Methodist churches, Nazarene churches, Assemblies of God, and leaving the area just because it's so inhospitable and brutal to live there. People are dying of what's called dust pneumonia when they're getting sick from the dust that's in the air. You have livestock that's dying because of there's the shortage of food. Farmers are having to feed tumbleweeds, Russian thistle, to their livestock. So, there were some sociologists that traveled to the region in the 30s and looked at the impact on these smaller churches and communities. And it's significant because along with schools, the local government, the church is a real heart of many of these communities. So to see them depopulated and disappear is a real hardship. And then there's also, like in Kansas, there's a real decline in church giving and the funding for these churches. So that's another kind of constant pressure that they're having. In my research, I was looking at this personal papers of one of these Methodist ministers named Paul Holmes, who served out in Western Kansas, and his sort of comments on experiencing these dust storms and trying to take care of small churches to be a sort of shepherd. It's a really powerful kind of testimony in a personal way about what's happening on the ground at the time.
I bet those were poignant to read. How did so you said the idea that prayer can't change weather in some of these liberal mainline Protestant churches, that would have been offensive to some religionists in the Midwest. Do you think it was offensive to most? I mean, people on the ground, religionists on the ground, were they also split between how to deal with the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression? Did some on the ground say, well, religion's not helping as much as I think it should, and another group just totally looking at it in religious terms and embracing it as such and doing what they can to, mollify its effects? Yeah.
It's hard to say, but I would just kind of hazard a generalization, I think, would be that most would have been offended by that kind of language about that they would have viewed as secular and probably blasphemous. Because when that forum came out and the news about it, you saw it start to pop up in newspapers around the country, and even in editorials denouncing this kind of thinking about cause and effect. But on the ground, there is a growing division of how to think about this and how to deal with it. One of the things I did in my earlier work was wrote quite a lot about apocalypticism in American religion, which is it's one of the driving forces behind Pentecostalism and the holiness movement. It's not as powerful among African American communities in these traditions, but it has a real strong hold among fundamentalists, Pentecostals, and holiness people in the 1930s. And for them, it looks like they're living through the book of Revelation, and there are even plagues of grasshoppers that they have to contend with. It looks like signs of the time. And that since it's such a key tenet of their faith that it's a confirmation of their religious worldview. And some of that apocalypticism, it's not surprising that some of the people who have that sort of view about the end of the world are suspicious of government efforts to meet this crisis and target some of the efforts of the Roosevelt administration.
Right.
Which, I mean, some of these efforts were really pretty effective. Like one was to plant trees up this corridor running north and south in these areas that had a lot of wind erosion. And quite a few of those trees are still there to this day. And they were meant to protect farmland. It's called the shelter belt. And I remember coming across one holiness writer who was saying, this is just ridiculous to think that they can do anything with these kinds of projects to change this harsh reality we live in.
So there's some who reject any efforts, but there are many religionists who accept them as part of the scheme, which they see religion as part of this, and it fits within their sort of structure of religion and dealing with the Great Depression.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, mainline Protestants are much more accepting. So these letters that pastors are sending to Roosevelt in 1935, quite a few of them are positive about what they're seeing on the ground, like the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the work programs, et cetera.
Okay. All right. Randall, of the Pentecostals and evangelicals, you write, quoting another historian, or you were quoting another historian in your book, quote, plain folk pioneers thus become pilgrims. And this is talking about now people moving and going to California. These religionists are driven out of the Midwest because of the Dust Bowl. Quote, plain folk pioneers thus become pilgrims burdened with the responsibility of evangelizing and civilizing, initially on the godless borderland of the Western South, then in the dark, secular reaches of Southern California, seeing their exodus and errand in California through the lens of the books of Daniel and Revelation, close quote. So this is talking about a particular group of religionists, Pentecostals and evangelicals, that were tracking here to California. What are you describing, or what was this historian describing here?
Yeah, it's a story I think most people are familiar with through the novel The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, of this massive movement of people. I think it's probably the largest movement of people, within the country at any point up to this time, at least. And it's about 300 to 400,000 Americans who leave the Dust Bowl region, but also areas in the Midwest that are just hit by drought for what they hope is a better life in California. I think other people would know about that story from Woody Guthrie's album that's these Dust Bowl ballads, where he's writing about this experience of these individuals. And many of them have this kind of plain folk religiosity. The historian Darren Dochuk writes about a kind of common sense evangelicalism, a sort of disregard for titles and for all things fancy. There's a populist streak that runs through this. And so these individuals go to California. Many of them settle in the Central Valley around Bakersfield and places like this. And there are sociologists at the time who are writing about this and talking about how they're sort of bringing their holiness and Pentecostalism to this region. And it's changing, it helps change the landscape of California and the religious landscape of California. And you can even trace these individuals eventually become supporters of Barry Goldwater and later Ronald Reagan, and have a kind of populist political orientation that matches their religious outlook.
And other religionists moved to California. Do we understand the numbers of those 400,000 religiously? What do you know about the numbers there?
Well, a lot of it's I'm thinking about a book by James Gregory where he talks about this exodus. I think the book's called American Exodus. A lot of them are white. They're poorer whites there'd be a lot of those who would be Southern Baptists. There would be some that were Methodists. In Steinbeck's novel, one of the most sort of sympathetic treatments, although there's sympathetic treatments of all the characters, I think, but one is actually a preacher who's sort of an aimless preacher who has a kind of complicated inner life, who represents part of this. And there's a brand new book by John Ebel where he talks about the people who settled in these camps that the government set up in the 30s, and the sort of conflicts that emerged in their experience. And it's a captivating story that I think a lot of Americans don't know a whole lot about. They know a little bit that this happened, but there's a lot here that's maybe because it was just such a painful experience for a lot of these people, it was something that's kind of forgotten and moved on from.
What did they find? What was the religious landscape of California? What did these people find, these evangelicals, Baptists, Pentecostals, Methodists, when they came to California with their religion? I'm thinking that most of them didn't shed their religion when they came. It was still part of their dealing with life, even if it had failed maybe to keep them where they were, and they saw a lot of horrible things. What did they see in California? What did they find?
They kind of gravitate to churches that, are the ones that they were familiar with. So if you were a member of the Church of the Nazarene, which is holiness, a largely white denomination, you would have tried to find that. And so we can track some of that they're finding a place there. And California itself is one of the kind of birthplaces of modern Pentecostalism in Los Angeles. So there was this long history of Pentecostalism and holiness being out there already. But one of the things that I think is so fascinating is the disdain that a lot of native Californians have for these newcomers. Like the terms that they used are derogatory, like calling someone an Okie or an Arkie, or another one they'd call them fruit tramps, that they just came there to work for seasonal labor in orchards and with fruit picking.
Right.
So there's even kind of official animosity to these people and what they represent. There's one of the best songs on Woody Guthrie's Dust Bowl Ballads is one about how these people making this trek, they think they're headed towards the promised land, but they quickly find out that it's something quite the opposite of that. And it has to do with money and power, and they don't have it.
Okay. And last question here on this phase. What did they, as they left the Dust Bowl, how did different religions see the sort of ecological disaster? Did some see it as we treated God's creation poorly? Did some see it as this is simply God's wrath? I mean, what were the various ways to view the ecological, not the economic? They're linked, obviously, but just the earth seemed to be in midst of destruction itself.
Yeah, it's a kind of event that's ripe for religious interpretation, and people are drawing really different religious lessons from it. For those who have more of an apocalyptic mindset, it's God punishing America for its many sins. And one of those for evangelicals, fundamentalists, Pentecostals would have been the repeal of prohibition that FDR initiates really early in his administration. And another one that they sometimes point out would be the recognition of communist Russia, the Soviet Union, official recognition by the United States under the Roosevelt administration. And it was, I knew that existed before I did the research, but it was surprising to see over and over again the prohibitionist angle and the fury at FDR for the repeal of prohibition. Now, some of the liberal Protestants I looked at, and Catholics as well, view this as punishment too, but they see it as the kind of punishment for this unregulated capitalism and the big business of farming and over-farming and destruction of the land. So you see these different, I mean, they're both thinking of it in those kinds of terms sometimes, and there are all sorts of other opinions as well, but they're just coming to very different conclusions about it.
Right. And I think I read that some were really did see it, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, as we have treated God's creation badly.
Yes.
And so the result is just natural. It's not necessarily God's wrath. It is that we treated his creation badly, and this is what happens when you do that. Was that a significant thought with some religions?
It is. I mean, you see that with liberal congregationalists like Arthur Holt, who is an agrarian, Christian agrarian, and with another individual from this era that writes about this. I think his name is Mark Dauber, who's writing about care of the land and how this is what happens when Christians aren't good stewards and they neglect God's sacred earth. And so you see this kind of lament. And the 30s really is a period of a renewal of agrarianism on all sorts of different fronts. I mean, there's religious agrarianism, there's sort of most social and political agrarianism that's tied to this return to a kind of regionalism. And you even see that in movements in art and painting, like the paintings of Thomas Hart Benton from this period.
Right. Okay. We are talking with Randall J. Stevens, professor of American and British Studies at the University of Oslo and author of the article, The Dust Bowl, The Depression and American Protestant Responses to Environmental Devastation, in the October 2023 issue of Church History, Studies in Christianity and Culture. Listeners, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Randall, can you tell our listeners what the Council for Social Action, or the CSA, was, what it did, and what it represented?
Yeah, so the Council for Social Action is this group that comes out of the Congregational denomination, and it's set up in 1934 with liberals and people who are on the left, and some of them are quite sort of far on the left, who were in this group. And it's, one of its main sort of objectives is to address the crisis in rural America, the poor conditions that people face in these small communities, and the fact that they're forgotten by their government and that they're the victims of unbridled capitalism and of exploitation. But the Council for Social Action, it operates on a lot of different sort of levels in this era, and it produces a magazine that ends up having a really large circulation, and it's a kind of gathering place for all of these liberals and leftist Protestants who are influenced by the social gospel and have pretty radical ideas. Like when I was reading through the issues at the archive in Boston, they're talking about the Spanish Civil War. They're talking about anti-lynching campaigns. They're talking about tenant farmers, and it's heavily influenced by the New Deal, and it's in line with that. But in certain ways, these are the kinds of people on the left who are actually a little more critical of the New Deal for not going far enough. But it was, I've mostly researched conservatism, and so for me, it was really interesting to see this other side of things. It was a different kind of experience of research, I would say.
Right. And this was a Congregationalist organization, and
yeah.
The magazine. What was the title of the magazine?
The magazine is called Christian Social Action, I think, the journal that comes out in this era. And it actually is it was really well designed and had this beautiful kind of 1930s artwork on the covers. And, it has some kind of the sort of leading intellectuals of the day who are writing in it or are being discussed. And like Ronald Niebuhr and the historian Charles Beard. There's socialists who are writing for it. but I kind of thought about it in the kind of larger arc of history at the time. This is also the period when the Communist Party USA grows dramatically, so that by the late 30s, it has something like, I think, like 65,000 members, and then it's up in the 70,000s in the 1940s. So it's part of a general kind of turn to the sort of, we think of the pendulum, like the pendulum going to the left in these years.
Right. Okay. I found this example startling regarding sort of liberal Protestants and Catholics on the one side and their reaction to the Great Depression. At the 1934 National Council of Methodist Youth Convention, attendees pledged, quote, "I surrender my life to Christ. I renounce the capitalist system," close quote. Could you say something about this, what it represented and how significant it is? I know this is part of what you just talked about generally, right? But what is going on here?
It's such an interesting quote, because I think today when we think of Christian youth organizations, we just kind of read them as conservative, and it's part of the story of the 30s as being sort of this kind of opportunity in a way for liberals and leftists to have more sway because of how serious the crisis was at the time. But you have that with youth movements in these churches. You also have Methodists and Baptists who were setting up these social action commissions and being quite bullish and vocal about their reaction against the inequalities of the decade that they see. And it's, there was this kind of stuff going on earlier in the century, but it seems like the volume of it and the seriousness of the conversation is on a different level, I think.
Right. What about the Federal Council of Churches Christian Rural Fellowship Bulletin? Can you tell us about the Federal Council of Churches briefly, and then what this Christian Rural Fellowship Bulletin represented, and then what?
Yeah. So this is sort of the kind of ecumenical kind of body of liberal Christianity in these years, and this Christian Rural Fellowship Bulletin is this effort that's also in that important year, 1934, when it's set up to address the concerns of rural people, kind of like the Council for Social Action is doing as well, and to try to promote soil stewardship, care of the land, and in a way to kind of sacralize the work that farmers do, and to get to do some work to try to ennoble these people who have been neglected for so long. And it just represents this larger sort of effort that you see happening in all sorts of different ways in the 1930s.
How big was, or can you tell our listeners sort of how large the numbers were that sort of saw the Great Depression as God's wrath and not to be mitigated, and the group of religionists who use their religion to help fix it, to see it as something that God in their mind, through their religion, wanted them to understand and to fix and help people improve. What's the comparison of numbers there?
It's hard to get an exact kind of read on it in certain ways, because on one hand, holiness and Pentecostalism as a movement is pretty small still compared to Baptists and Methodists. But I think that, and the other thing too is there are many different kinds of fundamentalist organizations, and they don't have the same, that they're fragmented in ways that other denominations aren't.
Right.
But the way that I tried to measure that was to look at how these subjects are being addressed in newspapers.
Right.
Because, like now with the digitization of newspapers, like using newspapers.com, you can do certain keyword searches and try to sort of track how this is being talked about in communities. Right. And I saw pretty good evidence that there's a lot of reporting, at least, about what one reporter called calamity howlers, people who talk about the apocalypse all the time and see all these signs as harbingers of doom. So there's plenty of that in the public record at the time.
Okay.
And I tried to look at some other kinds of polls. Gallup polling begins in 1935, and there were other kinds of religion polls in this era to get at least a sense of it. But at this stage, these polls have many flaws in them that won't be addressed until decades later. So that's another kind of level of it. The clergy letters to President Roosevelt, because there's just so many of them. There's thousands and thousands of these. This is another way to think about how did a sort of regular pastor who was a Baptist or a Methodist or a Presbyterian or a Catholic priest think of this. So that might be a kind of truer sample.
Right. And listeners, we do plan on doing a podcast episode about these clergy letters to FDR, which will be a fantastic discussion. Randall, also, what I found fascinating is this new holiday on the church calendar that a group created. And I don't remember, you can share the details, which group it was, but they called it Rural Life Sunday. That caught my attention. Can you tell us about that briefly?
Yeah, this is something that the historian Kevin Lowe has written about, really, in a really good book about Christian agrarianism. So it's this collaborative effort to have a holiday set aside to raise awareness about stewardship of the land, of soil stewardship, agrarian kinds of Christian values. And I think it's a little bit after Easter. It's some weeks after Easter, during the spring or, before early summer. And it was this really wide effort that included Catholics and Protestants to, where you had people writing prayers and liturgies about stewardship of the land and trying to kind of, they probably went a little bit overboard in some ways because they valorized farm labor in ways that I don't know that farmers really see it quite like that. But it's, I came back to this before, but it's this idea of sort of the celebration of manual labor in all sorts of different ways that you see in the 1930s. And this is certainly a part of that.
If it's still on the church calendar, is it still a thing?
Yeah, I'm not totally positive. There was another thing like this that was called Soil Stewardship Sunday, which is another effort to, which is funny because it sounds scientific and it seems like, I don't know, if you're like a 15-year-old boy, you'd think this sounds really boring to be talking about soil. But it is part of these attempts, during the Dust Bowl and after the Dust Bowl to really take seriously care of the land.
Right. It would be interesting to track that through religious bodies after the Depression and see, and bringing us up to today.
It's one thing that Kevin Lowe, in his book, he does talk about the fading of some of this energy by the late 1960s. So there's a bit at the end of his book. It's got a great title. It's called, I think it's called Baptized in Soil.
Oh, okay. And the topic, the specific topic of his book?
Christian agrarianism through the 20th century.
Okay, that sounds like a fascinating thing. I'll have to look at that. Okay, let's take the rest of the time, Randall, to talk about the response to the New Deal.
Mm-hmm.
So Harold Ickes, FDR's Secretary of the Interior, once quipped, quote, "The New Deal is the cause of Christ," close quote. Among religionists, who in general agreed and who did not? Let's talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Allison Green has looked at, in Mississippi, she's found some evidence that that there would be people who we wouldn't suspect normally who would be supporters of the New Deal who were supporters. In the Great Plains, I found a pretty sharp division between these, new religious movements like holiness and Pentecostalism, who tended to not support it and actually be very critical of Roosevelt, and in some cases to talk about Roosevelt being the Antichrist. And you'd see that more with fundamentalists, something that Matthew Sutton has written about in his book about the apocalypse. But for the supporters, it would be Protestants and Catholics, people who are part of the Federal Council of Churches. There's another historian, Mark Stoll, who's written a wonderful book about the kind of Protestant roots of the modern environmentalist movement. And Presbyterians and Congregationalists are really critical in the development of ecological concern and later environmentalism. And it's, it makes sense because actually there were people who were part of the New Deal apparatus coalition who were themselves liberal Protestants, who were trained within the social gospel movement. So, liberal Protestantism in a kind of way is sort of or liberal Catholicism is a kind of preferred religiosity of the New Deal. And when you look at who supported the New Deal nationally, I think that Jewish communities maybe were the most supportive, and Catholicism is really high up there. And then it's very mixed when it comes to Protestants. But, if you could break down Protestants between those who are more liberal and those who are more conservative or to the right, that's certainly where we'd see those distinctions.
Right. Part of your article touches on how, what I think you wrote, how the low churches, quote unquote, which I wasn't familiar with that term, maybe I'm getting it wrong, how they saw the New Deal. And you've talked a little bit about this. I think these were like Pentecostal holiness type groups, but they may have been even more drilled down a little bit. I'm looking at my notes. Mark of the Beast, Sabbath breaking, immorality, insect. So can you tell us a little about these religious voices? Am I getting it right? You talk a little bit about them.
Yeah, that's a good question. When we say low church, it's versus high church. So like a high church would be a church that's more, it follows the liturgical calendar. It has a more kind of formal style of worship. And a low church is one that does away with a lot of that.
Okay, I am familiar with those terms. I think when I read it in your article, when it started talking about these things, it seemed really quite different. I was thinking maybe you meant something else. But okay, so tell us more about some of these things that you mentioned.
So the opposition was really intense when you see it. But the one thing that I was struck by is, like, I went through a lot of the publications of the Church of the Nazarene, which is headquartered in Kansas City at the time, a holiness church. And they just rarely talk about, in their main publication, it's called the Herald of Holiness. You rarely hear any kind of addressing of what's going on domestically or the Dust Bowl or rampant poverty and suffering. You don't see that nearly as much, and there's a tendency to kind of spiritualize those sorts of difficulties. But those times that you do see a mention of the New Deal or of Roosevelt, it's almost always in negative terms, especially like with the official organ of the church. And the same is true of the Pentecostal Holiness Church, which is it has a heavy presence in Oklahoma at the time. And I found in their main publication, they actually included this long editorial by a pastor from another denomination where he just denounced Roosevelt, said that Roosevelt was it was sort of creeping communism or socialism that was like a Trojan horse of bringing this dangerous political system into the country. So when there would be political engagement sometimes, but it would be on a different kind of register than you would see among the mainline. And it would really be the opposite of the Council for Social Action.
Right. And what was this mark of the beast? Did you see this often used? What was it used? How was it used?
Yeah, it was to describe something about the Roosevelt administration. I think that was in a magazine from the West Coast, one of these fundamentalist
Okay.
magazines.
Okay.
Occasionally that, drawing on the Book of Revelation and apocalyptic themes, you would even
Right.
see some anti-Semitism that would appear in fundamentalist circles to denounce Roosevelt and advisors and supporters who were Jewish.
Right.
It could get pretty ugly and nasty.
You didn't look at the Jewish response to the Dust Bowl. You mentioned at the beginning there were a few pockets of Jewish settlements or towns or synagogue, congregations. Any insight to their approach?
There'd be very little and almost nothing in western Kansas and in the Panhandle. So you would see synagogues in larger cities like Kansas City and other cities in the Midwest. But that was one. When I did it, I want to, like when I do a fuller project of this, I want to try to talk more about these other traditions. I wanted to narrow it with Protestantism, and for the current article, also the area that's heaviest hit by the Dust Bowl is it's one of the whitest parts of the U.S. and actually has some sundown towns in it where African Americans were harassed and run out of town. But in the larger project, I want to try to talk about Native American responses,
right?
Who they also aren't. They don't tend to live in the areas that are heaviest hit by the Dust Bowl, but still, they'd be on the plains and they'd be impacted by drought. And what was the thinking there?
Right.
But I mean, as far as Judaism goes, the support of Roosevelt was so strong within Jewish communities. And it's so much heavier on the East Coast than it is in the West.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that would be that. The Native American response would be fascinating to understand, and of course, religion is just sort of part of their being, and so there we would get an understanding of their religious understanding of what was going on. That would be fascinating.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the Pentecostal fundamentalist reaction to the New Deal was driven mostly by his repeal of prohibition and his and communism. I guess formalizing ties with with Russia. Is that true? That those are the two biggest drivers?
Yeah, and I think on another level too, the government just isn't really a part of people's lives like it will become in the 1930s and after in the 1930s. So it's, if we try to think from their point of view, these look like really radical experiments that seem iffy, to say the least, for them. One of the main ways that Americans would encounter the government in earlier decades was through the mail, through the military and through the new tax system. But it wasn't present in people's lives like it will be after the New Deal. So I think there's a part of this that's very anti-statist, that's against these kinds of what they view as an overbearing government that's experimenting with economic systems and experimenting with agriculture. So that's a bit of it as well, but definitely the prohibition part is huge.
Right. And I guess the prohibition and the communism parts there's religious threads in both of those, right?
Oh, yeah.
Communism is atheist, and prohibition obviously speaks to alcohol and any religion's view on that.
The communism thing too is a threat for the mission field as far as many of these groups and denominations are concerned, and that just grows when you get to the 40s and 1950s.
Right. Okay. Last question, Randall. As we conclude, do you want to share any lessons or takeaways from the article that you wrote, either in terms of important historical transformations you were charting, or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment in the American narrative?
Yeah, thank you. for me, we all write history, through the present in some way. This is something that Arthur Schlesinger talked about. It would be, foolhardy to say that we don't. And I think the world we live in now, we always, as historians, make connections between, whether we even kind of know it consciously or not, between our present and the past that we study. But for me, one of the big things here is that, the role that human activity can have on our environment and the consequences of that. Even though there's a bit of a debate about the degree to which overfarming and erosion was caused by human activity, but I think that there probably are more people who think that than don't think it. And it's pretty clear, though, that the loss of topsoil worsened conditions, and then the religious understanding of this and the meaning of it, and sort of the religious lens of thinking about or looking at how the government should be involved and what role churches should play as opposed to the state, and what kind of human activity can reverse some of these trends.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. We have been talking with Randall J. Stevens, professor of American and British Studies at the University of Oslo and author of the article, The Dust Bowl, the Depression and American Protestant Responses to Environmental Devastation, in the October 2023 issue of Church History, Studies in Christianity and Culture. Listeners, again, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Randall, fantastic the hour with you today. Thank you for being with us and helping us comprehend the American Project better by understanding, or beginning to understand, helping us begin to understand how religion, fueled by the idea of religious freedom as found in the U.S. Constitution, engaged with the Great Depression. It was informative and enlightening, and I hope you enjoyed the time with us as well.
Thank you so much. I really did.
The podcast series Religion in the American Experience is a project of the National Museum of American Religion. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.